Thank you for being here this morning. Appreciate you coming. I am Ari Markinson. I'm a healthcare and corporate partner here at Venable. Do a good deal of work in the healthcare services space. A lot of work with professional practice management type stuff. Recently finished a book called "What is the Corporate Practice of Medicine?" Because basically I essentially just send that to clients rather than talk to them about it on a 24/7 basis. A lot of folks who are doing these kinds of things have to get past corporate practice issues and fee splitting issues and those kinds of things. What I'm going to do is quickly have each of our panelists for today introduce themselves, and then we'll get into our conversation. We will, unless there's sort of a burning question, I think we'll leave questions towards the end. Give time to questions at the end. With that said, Ed, why don't you start?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Ed Broom. I'm Managing Director with Third Healthcare Partners, private equity firm based in New York. We are solely focused on healthcare. About a third of our investments are in the physician practice space, and we have investments spanning GI, women's health, behavioral health, cardiology, a lot of different practices. So looking forward to speaking with you today.
Andy.
Thanks, Ari. Yeah, good morning. Really great to see everyone, and also just great to be back in person. It's a lot of fun to be sharing a cup of coffee again with folks. So my name is Andy Colbert. I'm one of the partners at Ziegler. We are a privately held investment bank. I think one of the oldest healthcare investment banks in the country, over 100-year history. I joined in 2006. Task of building out an M&A advisory practice. And so I have successfully now built out, we've got about a team of 45 M&A bankers, 10 partners, each of us covering various sub-verticals across the healthcare system. I lead the physician practice vertical and have been very active in this market. And obviously we'll get into that today. I think we've transacted over 50 physician companies since I joined, probably over almost $5 billion in total value. So it's been an active 16 years now. And so I've got a team based here in New York that works under me and kind of driving our physician efforts. Our focus is really across the country and groups of all different specialties. We're spending a lot of time in primary care, orthopedics. Certainly risk-based models is a big focus of ours in groups that are kind of emerging and heading into either value-based care, capitated contracting, spending time in outpatient ancillary services like radiology or ASCs. Women's health is another area. And then obviously more traditional areas like GI, anesthesia, emergency medicine, we spend a lot of time in. And typically working on deals, anywhere from call it 10 to 50 of EBITDA is kind of our sweet spot. I'd say, the lion's share of our deals are kind of in the, 10 to 30 of EBITDA. So, enterprise values anywhere from call it 100 to 500 million is typically where we're focused. And obviously it's a great spot where there tends to be a lot of activity, and looking forward to talking more about it today.
My name is Roy Bergerano. I know these three fine gentlemen very well. Always a pleasure to spend time with them in a panel discussion. I would do it if there was nobody here. My background, I co-founded and run Scale Healthcare, which is a very fast-growing healthcare consulting company with 3 or 4 other things that we do on top of meat and potato consulting business. We also do outsourced services. So we have a large billing business, finance and accounting, healthcare marketing, IT systems, data analytics. It's a long list of additional teams and departments, and in some cases, companies that we formed. And then on top of that, we're an education business. We have a growing subscription-based, content-driven business that a lot of healthcare CEOs are subscribing to. And then lastly, we're also in the investment business as well. We've co-invested in 4 private equity deals and have recently acquired a small primary care practice.
Great. Thanks, gentlemen. What we're going to do is I'm going to throw some questions out at these three fine gentlemen, and we're going to hopefully have a nice conversation about what's doing in PPM investments. Andy, let me start with one for you, which will then have everybody else chime into to the extent they have some comments, which is M&A transaction volume as a whole, right, is down. There's no question about it. The overall marketplace just seems a complete mess. It's off. Healthcare deals in the aggregate are down. But that may be a function of the fact that Pfizer's not doing a $20 million merger with somebody else, right? However, PPM deals, right, seem to be pretty insane. There's a lot of folks very interested in PPM deals. There's a lot of folks rolling up different types of professional practices. What's going on? Why? What do you think?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. Interestingly enough, if you look at the first 2 quarters of this year, physician deals are actually up 25% over the same period last year. So, not only is the physician sector kind of against the overall trend, it's increasing considerably. And then physician deals as a percentage of total healthcare deals has gone up significantly. Historically they've been 10 to 15%. Now I'd say it's well into the 25+% range of just pure volume number of transactions. I think that there's a number of factors that's driving that. One, there's still about, even though there's been a lot of activity over the years, and it may seem like the market has consolidated up, about 50% of all physician practices are still independent. So there's still quite a lot of runway and a lot of opportunity for consolidation. I think what's happening is, COVID really, in many ways, was a pause button for a number of groups. They got stimulus funding. They, received grant payments. Ended up weathering, I think, much better than people initially expected. That being said, I think for anyone that's nearing a retirement, seeing retirement 5, even 10 years down the road, I think like all of us, it was a bit of a wake-up call to where do I want to be when I grow up? And I think a lot of physician partners, like any business owner, is kind of waking up to saying, okay, maybe there is value in partnering in private equity, in consolidation. And so I think there's just a greater acceptance, a greater awareness, as well as if you think about a lot of the other sectors in healthcare, there's few sectors in healthcare that have the degree of fragmentation that the physician landscape has. And if you think about the core private equity playbook, right, it's, buy a platform asset and then leverage down your multiple over time to do smaller tuck-in deals at lower multiples. It's much harder to do that in, areas that are already heavily consolidated and you've got to pay platform multiples for every deal. Physicians is still a great area where you can buy the 30, 40 person initial group and do the 3 to 5 physician tuck-ins at much lower multiples. And quite candidly, what we're seeing in a number of specialties, the players at the platform level is kind of getting relatively established, and then they're the ones that are kind of going out and just bringing in all the smaller players. And so I think you're going to see continued activity across these specialties. How many new platforms is going to be dependent on the dynamics of the individual specialty, but you certainly will continue to see a lot of activity, and you're seeing second, third bites of the apple, which I think is important. To have those success stories and be able to demonstrate to the physicians that the equity really means something and there's value in it in the future, which is always one of the first questions you get from the physician. So we're definitely bullish on this trend to continue. And in some ways, I think with other segments getting hit harder, like the tech segment or consumer products, if anything, it's actually making healthcare more attractive as an area for funds to put more emphasis in this market.
Yeah, something that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a wonderful question. We could just spend time on just this one question and not move from here. And we could expand it to what's going on today and what's going to happen tomorrow. I like the tomorrow question even more. So I think of it as a pie chart that used to be split somewhat down the middle, 50% hospital employed, 50% private practice. And if you were a physician leaving your fellowship, leaving your healthcare system as an associate, you're asking yourself, where should I go? Should I pick up my hospital employment check, or should I go and start my own practice and pick a market? And that was it. That was the full extent of your choices. And so the question, as I interpret it, is what will the pie chart look like tomorrow, meaning 10 years from now? And so we know that today it's actually three pieces, right? The three options that exist are large, consolidating, roll-up, aggregate MSO, big, bulky, fast-growing behemoth that's rolling up practices. Should I join that as a physician, as a young physician? Should I start my own practice, or should I take that hospital job? And then embedded in that question is one of those pie charts going away permanently, which is the private practice option. And there I'm going to be a little bit contrarian with myself and say I don't think it's going away. I think it's just not going to be as large a piece of the pie chart as it used to be. So you're still, I know surgeons that left the hospital to form their own practice, starting from scratch day one. They're now employing physicians, credentialing them in a world that they're fully aware of, where large private equity-backed MSOs are offering all kinds of interesting upside incentive arrangements with lots of growth attached. And still these physicians select private practice, independently owned group as an alternative. And delving into why is that? Why is the private practice option still very, very attractive? And I think if you get into the whys, you'll get into why it will probably be still very attractive 10 years from now. There's a lot that a young physician can do with a business that a young analyst looking for an investment banking career can't do with a boutique M&A shop. And when you contrast those two things very closely, you find some very interesting things.
We have never been busier than we are right now. I know that other people may be slowing down, but in particular within the PPM space, our deal volume is at a fever pitch, both in terms of platforms that we're looking at and for add-ons to our existing platforms. I guess I think about it in three ways. It could be a little bit redundant and maybe a little bit challenging to something that Roy just said. So from the physician perspective, physicians, I think, are just much better educated about this being an option than they were in the past. If we were to go to sort of a national meeting of cardiologists or GI docs or any specialty 5 years ago, private equity was this, I don't quite know what that is. Is that venture capital? Like, are they going to buy me? What does that mean? Now, even having first conversations with physicians, we find that they're quite educated, right? Maybe they've already been approached. They've certainly heard of kind of colleagues having a, liquidity event, and they've just learned a bit about what's going on. I think they're also motivated, and this is a little bit contrasting what Roy just said. Health systems continue to get bigger, and from the individual physician's perspective, well, health systems and payers continue to get bigger, and they see them as these sort of dominant forces in the market that are increasingly sort of impinging on the physician way of life, right? You have sort of your physicians, your health systems, and your payers. The payers and the health systems have consolidated dramatically over the last 5-10 years. And so if the physicians don't, they're just sort of left without a seat at the table as health systems and payers jockey for power. And particular market. And then third, I think that, I mean, we are seeing a number of new funds sort of pushing into the space. I would say that all of the people, all of our colleagues who were there forming physician platforms 5 years ago are still there and have expanded their their portfolios, whether it's sort of moving from ortho to another specialty or expanding within a particular specialty. But there are lots more funds who typically we hadn't seen in the space, who have seen it generate attractive returns for other funds and are, deciding to push in.
Let me respond
Go ahead.
to the pushback. So yeah, the size of the private practice independent owned space or market shrinks.
Yeah.
But the point that I'm making is something will be left. And the nature of what will be left, I think, is different. So I'm not pushing on you. You should push on what I said and have me refine it. I think the nature of what constitutes an independently owned practice used to be very broad. The culture used to be very broad. I used to find everything and anything in the world of private practice. I think increasingly we're going to find risk-seeking, equity value orientated, growth orientated, niche market knowledge orientated, whether it's payer relationships, referral relationships, whether it's unique access through teaching programs and fellowships to recruiting, some kind of niche advantage that is attached to, I'm going to grow this thing. And by the way, the few surgeons that I can think of that just launched their own vascular practice are growing very rapidly out of a hospital system. So what we'll see less and less of is the physicians that I grew up with marrying into a family of physicians. I just have a practice. It just does well. I don't know why. So I think those days are going, probably won't come back anytime in our lifetimes because competition has increased. The tide on competition has increased for everyone. But I do think it's a contrarian statement to make and a very positive one to say that actually the option of three will remain. It may change the nature of, what does it mean to work inside of a hospital that's competing with three very large private equity-backed MSOs. So the nature of everything changes, but I think good options remain, which is positive.
I think, look, a quick comment to your pie chart is that rural healthcare, right, is always going to be there, and you're not going to have PPMs looking to manage a practice in Nome, right? Alaska, it's just not. There's no efficiency to that. There's nothing that works there. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, no
right?
hospitals.
And so you will unequivocally still have, particularly in rural healthcare, just you can't have PPM penetration there.
That's a great point. The point about M&A volume, up, down, I sort of think of it as left, right, not up, down. Because what I see is a changing nature of taste and activity. So the actual location of activity changes. Now we're busy in fertility. Soon we'll be, I predict, busy in plastics. So it's not just more OBGYN practices. It's also the introduction of telemedicine as a source of income, the introduction of new tuck-ins, right? It's not more of the same primary care tuck-ins. It's let's go tuck in pathology. So what's driving M&A volume is not so much more of the same, but more of more.
You're leading us to our next conversation, which we're going to start with Eve, which is the sort of, I always say it this way. There's always the ology of the week, right? Who likes what this week? And why don't we have a conversation about, what your folks are seeing. We'll start with you, Beta, about, what folks are interested in at the moment.
I think that the private equity, like any field, needs to learn about the investments that they're taking on. And so it was only sort of natural that the first areas that we pushed into derm, that more cash pay, more consumer-like focus, less sort of complex regulatory burdens, less reimbursement risk, less sort of complex relationships with physicians to figure out. And over time, those funds that have spent more time in this space have moved from your sort of early derm platforms to more complex GI and ophthalmology and other areas where every specialty is different. Every specialty has unique ways of creating value. In one specialty, it might be maximizing some imaging ancillaries plus path, and another, it might be owning a particular type of outpatient center for doing certain types of procedures. But like the idea of we're just going to consolidate, get better rates from our payers that will drive more EBITDA and increase the value of the platform. I think that's a very sort of simplistic view of how to approach physician practice management. And so, yes, from where I sit, the ologies have evolved as the private equity firms have sort of learned the intricacies and in and outs of different spaces. And the physicians within those spaces have either been educated or have sort of come around to private equity ownership. There's also, we find it's very difficult to just buy one, to start as a platform with 1-2 doctor practice, right? That's some firms certainly do that, but there's a certain amount of warehouse risk and complexity to that very early stage aggregation of practices. And so more often what we see is physicians will come together to form a larger group that then creates the platform that private equity will use to enter and then do add-ons to it. And it's also just taken some time to move from one ology to the other to have those kind of foci form such that private equity can get a toehold and enter a particular space.
Yeah, I might just chime on that. I think what's interesting as I see the evolution of where the deal flow is a lot of it is really driven by where can we take costs out of the system. I think is a much bigger focus now than maybe it was 10 years ago in the early days of PPM consolidation, right? The early days of PPM consolidation was definitely more of a driving economies of scale and leveraging scale to negotiate better rates. I think now with the pushback from a lot of the major health plans, you saw what happened with United against Envisions of the world, right? I think those scaled players, if anything, have become under more scrutiny than less. So I think now it's a very different conversation with managed care, which is we're going to focus on specialties that are significantly lower cost to provide these services in a lower cost care setting outside of the hospital, be it, areas like GI, right, or orthopedics. And some of that is driven in part by Medicare, by CMS. When CMS enables reimbursement of total hips or total joints in an outpatient setting, that gives a lot of impetus to really drive growth in the ASC investments. But I think private equity is much more attuned to that now versus the old days of we're just going to buy dermatology because we think it's under penetrated from a supply standpoint. We're just going to open a bunch more offices. At the end of the day, that's probably adding more cost to the ecosystem than cutting, right? Versus being able to say, hey, we're going to do a joint at, X $1,000 that's, 30% less than what it would cost in a hospital setting. That's a great conversation to have with the payers.
I just keep going back to your question. There's so many things to say about it. It's really such a rich question. So, what is going on in PPM world from a macro perspective? And again, comparing it to other industries, I think is very interesting too. So where's the lights out, new entrant technology risk that's putting all of us out of business? Hasn't happened, unlikely to happen anytime soon. So we can plan ahead, business as usual. Where is the economies of scale that are so rich that it creates a natural monopoly that puts us all out of business? So you look at Optum. Why isn't Optum overpaying for everything, but it's fine because on a pro forma adjusted basis, their multiple is just fine. And the rest of us can't compete. That hasn't happened. And so you almost have this Goldilocks scenario in healthcare services where economies of scale are good, but they're not too good. If they were too good, we would be too late, all of us, in all these specialties, because very few of us are the first, or very few of us are the largest. They're good, but competition remains intact as we move from 10 to 500 to $1 billion of value creation. What else is happening in healthcare services land that drives volume in M&A is every one of these new entities created is its own culture and library of intellectual property that, as long as retention is somewhat good and culture is somewhat good, leads to more activity. So you form a DSO or a derm MSO, that derm MSO then becomes a living, breathing organism that continues to do tuck-ins for years to come. What also happens is that private equity group that was there day one retains its intellectual property and learns, just as BD said, that I can do more than derm. I can now do derm and dental. I can now do derm, dental, and ortho. It's amazing the amount of turnover in employees in an average private equity group is somewhere between 0 and 1%. Nobody leaves. It's permanent. It's lifelong engagement. And so the richness of knowledge gained is lifelong. And you see it manifested in more and more and more confidence and conviction in activity. It doesn't mean that everything succeeds, but the level of intellectual property around consolidating PPM just goes up and up and up from year to year. And I do feel that in every phone conversation, every year, the level of experience just broadens and deepens and deepens. The last point I'll make on this is there are some chapters here that haven't been written. There are some huge lessons that haven't been learned, which I'm going to find particularly interesting. Where are the economies of scale and diseconomies of scale between $1 billion and $5 billion worth of volume in PPM space? What is one too many tuck-ins? And I see that sort of at an anecdotal level. We bought too much too quickly. We bought too many physicians and weren't able to create succession for them. So too much appetite, too much activity. But I don't know that I've necessarily seen too much experience with these large cap platforms. And I think that's still all ahead of us.
Two thoughts, and this is interesting. This is sort of comes up where Need mentioned some things in both the first questions we asked about, which is, I think it's very interesting how we've gone from, I will only buy all cash pay derm or all cash pay plastics because, boy, there's a lot of money there. We'll just all come to it right away, right? To almost a real estate investment play, and I'll explain the analogy I'm making, in Medicaid primary care by certain family offices or small or down market, middle market shops, because what they're looking at is an investment that, from their perspective, if it's run well, is essentially a lease that makes them 5% over 20 years, right? Like it's just a constant flow of dollars out of a government program. If they can manage it well, it makes them money. It may not be making them 12%, but it's a decent investment. And so I think that dynamic, the way that that's changed, has been very, very interesting, where you've seen a lot more investors coming out of lots of different spots where they're comfortable investing in things that have almost 100% government reimbursement, right? Where before that, it was all about cash is king, right? And so I think that's really interesting, and to how that's changed in the marketplace. Okay, why don't we we've spoken to this a little bit, but why don't we push along a little bit more? We have seen so platform acquisitions and more so add-ons in this space, right, used to have a much lower valuation threshold. Everyone thought that not only was the fragmentation giving them all this opportunity because of the fragmentation, but you could get a doctor to sell practice at 2 times, right? Like this was just an easy thing to do and wrap them all up and great, great value to be created there. But that's really changed. Why? What do you think's going on, Roy? Come on.
Well, I mean, the more confidence and conviction in success, future-based success, the more you're willing to pay for something, the more tools you have at your disposal to manifest that success, both on the downside. If this happens, I've already dealt with this before. And on the upside, if I can't grow through physical therapy, then I know I'm going to grow through anesthesia. The less the risk component, and less risk, same return, more return equals higher upfront price, and the modeling still works. I don't think it's immune to exogenous factors, right? Interest rates at zero, maybe even negative on a real basis, equals limitless access to capital, and not much spend on that capital equals more confidence in pricing. So I think that environment is changing. So an interesting question embedded in your question is what happens now? And I do think that we'll see a surprising amount of M&A volume in this space over the next 2-3 years, which is a big statement, because I also think that the next 2 or 3 years are going to continue to be what I call an unusually difficult business environment for physician practice management. And that's a long time to be in a difficult environment. So I think countervailing forces are at play here. I don't think we're going to be seeing higher multiples over the next 2-3 years than we've seen over the past 2-3 years, but somewhere between the same and slightly lower seems realistic to me. And that's a crazy statement to make for someone who thinks we're heading into a recession.
Yeah, and I would add on, Ari, I think your comment is interesting. What we see is almost a bell curve when we think about value or EBITDA multiple relative to size of the practice. There's almost, it feels a sweet spot where there's a maximum number of bidders and buyers and interest for a business. If it's too small, to your point, 1, 2, 3 doctors, there's no question a steep discount. But there's also the other end of the extreme where you see the big public companies and the massive platforms that now have thousands of doctors, and the growth is just hard to keep up, right? And it's challenging to continue to grow 30% when you're $2 billion in revenue, right? And so it's interesting. There does become a point where you've almost gotten too big and the multiple starts to come back down. And so, I mean, I think what's interesting in this space is if you're private equity, you want to kind of get in at the right moment, but you also want to get out at the right moment, because, I don't think anyone wants to be trying to sell, a multi-billion-dollar private practice. That's a challenging deal to do, and there's only a handful of buyers, and with the public markets not really available and open right now, there's just a limit to capital availability. And so, your sweet spot is probably in that, 10 to 200 million of EBITDA, right, is really where you want to be to kind of get in and get out and maximize value potential, if you really want to think about maximizing the bell curve.
Can I also offer? Go ahead.
Sure. I just so I pretty much entirely agree with everything that both of you guys have said. The one thing that I would add is for the entry multiple for smaller practices, there's a level of physician expectation of, hey, I'm a great doc. That guy over there, I heard, I don't know whether this is right or not, that he got 10x and I'm a better doc, so I should get 12x, right? And so, and I'm sure you deal with this a lot in tempering those expectations. And it's not about their perception, but actually about the value creation levers, the value that they've already realized, like things that matter to us from a business perspective. So that's one. And then I think there's also, I said before, there's more private equity firms that are kind of coming into the space and are a bit less experienced in the space, and they're perhaps how they're underwriting some of the risk around the value creation levers is not as sometimes I just think not as fully developed as others who've been in the space longer. And so they're willing to splash out for a higher entry multiple, even for, in some cases, very small, quote unquote, platform sometimes it really is a question like, what is a platform? People say, oh, we have a platform, we have 5 doctors. Like, is that really a platform, or is that just a single practice?
Platform in Rockland County.
It's a platform in Rockland County, yep, or in lots of parts of the country that could be the largest practice in the state, kind of thing. But yeah, I think that kind of that increased focus from private equity, plus some of those expectations from doctors who already have a very strong self-worth.
I also think, and I've been there, private equity, large private equity backed board, and what are we spending our time thinking about? And it's amazing. You should never underestimate how much time is spent by boards across the country on playbooks that we know work, and how little time is spent on playbooks that no one has any idea whether it's going to take 5 years, going to take 500 million, 50 million, 5 million, how much volatility. And so that those ideas are sort of pushed to the side. And I think that we're in this Goldilocks period again with practice, M&A volume and valuations where everyone knows it works. There's plenty of supply still. There's plenty of demand. And so you have large, medium and small aggregators that are all focused on the same play and the same target. I think there's a few countervailing forces that will push us away from that with every year that passes. One is the recognition that the law of size, it's just harder to get to 30% growth when it's true. 2 is the supply is going to constrain. So there'll just be less supply. And 3, this one will be interesting. There are going to be some pioneers who are actually willing to engage in interesting new playbooks. What am I doing in Europe? You know, the amount of inactivity between all the US-based MSOs and any and every market in Europe is just staggering to me. It's not like, you know, other industries from the US haven't taken the trip over to Europe and had wonderful experiences. It's not like Europe doesn't offer 50 different markets. You can pick the one that you like the most. But the complete dismissal of all of it is just a sign of how rich the environment is in the US right now, so we don't need to bother. Telemedicine, virtual care, the digitization of healthcare, automation of healthcare. These are all sort of new fields that large MSOs will be very well positioned to attack, just like large US banks in 1970 were uniquely well positioned to do more than US banking. So we've got these chapters ahead of us. What will be interesting is when a board only wants to meet for 1.5 hours. And if they spent the 1.5 hours talking about Europe, there's just not a lot of time left for what are we doing in practice consolidation here in the US. So I think the refocus of some of these large entities over time will detract from some of the valuation multiples you're seeing today because everyone is executing the exact same playbook.
Try telling a French physician on the private side of their healthcare marketplace how many patients they need to see.
Avoid France. Fly over France. Go straight to Germany.
Anyhow, I want to get onto this question because I always think it's important whenever you're talking about PPM structures, which is sort of and Bede, we'll start with you, the importance of if you're going to do this, what we've always talked about in terms of alignment between the investors and the professionals, and how important is that? What are the keys to getting that right? What are the keys to getting it wrong? Kind of thing. So
yeah, there are lots of ways to get it wrong. We spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about how we both create the initial structures that will sort of foster alignment, and then we put a ton of time into the relationship with our physicians to help grow that alignment over time. We fundamentally believe in much more of a partnership model than an ownership model. That's part of our, philosophy of how we approach our physician platforms. Because, at the end of the day, one, just from a legal perspective, the physicians maintain complete and total autonomy over all of their clinical decisions, right? And so we don't ever try to touch that. But from a practice perspective, physicians have strong opinions for how they want to carry out their day and how they want to interact with APPs in their office and what they feel is, to your comment earlier, an appropriate, both from a clinical and just a personal perspective, amount of sort of operational efficiency, scheduling density that they're bringing into their practice. So, I think alignment begins with making sure that the physicians remain invested in the business from a financial perspective, and that they are seeing a lot of that financial return over time. It's also important to think about both the younger physician and the older physician, right? Practices aren't just a group of 40 to 50-year-old physicians, right? There are some who are right out of fellowship, who are thinking about how they're going to have a 30-plus year career in medicine, and there are others who are 2 years away from retirement. And the incentives and the alignment that you need to create with each of those different pools of physicians is very different. Yeah, that's it.
Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a constant communication, a recognition that the physician group is by far and away the most valuable asset that you have. Most of the time, the feedback they provide is the right feedback for what the organization needs and the best feedback for what the organization needs. So you probably can't gather enough feedback from a physician group. Relying on one representative leader is a common mistake. It's very easy, it's very efficient to have one physician, medical director, maybe CEO, maybe president, maybe head of clinical PC, who speaks on behalf of X 50, 100, 200 physicians and think that your job is done. I would caution against that. There are many voices, there are many opinions. It's not a blind messianical following of whatever physician feedback you have is the direction of the organization. Sometimes the investor and the agents representing the investor have a better understanding of a given topic, but it doesn't mean that the conversation doesn't have to happen. There's a lot of effort put into explaining and educating, right? So you explained and you educated at the point of investment through the M&A process. That kind of explaining and educating should continue, should persist throughout. And I think if you're very lastly, as a lesson, very careful and selective about protecting, preserving the culture of the organization that you thought you were buying into, by being careful about who you let in thereafter, as long as you hold on to that culture of open communication, of growth orientation, of risk management, if these things are embedded into the way you build your organization, then you probably have a very healthy outcome. If you prioritize one goal ahead of all others, culture is probably more rapidly and more frequently ruined by excessive growth than anything else. Then you find it ever harder to hold on to that culture. Excessive growth equals dilution in the quality of the team around you, and also equals dilution in the ability of the operations infrastructure to handle all that growth. So physicians that are very much on board, as long as they see timely reporting, become disruptive physicians when you can no longer provide honest, open, reliable feedback on how your organization is doing. So these kinds of goals normally are very well correlated with very, very good physician-investor relations.
So I want to speak to just the economic alignment, because I think one of the challenges often is the mentality of private equity and the mentality of private practice physicians economically can be polar opposites, right? Physicians in private practice typically measure their success economically on how much did I make this year, or how much did I make this quarter, right? They're thinking about it from a short-term cash compensation success. Private equity fundamentally is what did I buy at and what did I sell at? And that might be 5, 7 year, 10-year horizon. They're less focused on the individual marks in the inner period. And so I think one of the challenges, private equity sits down with the docs and they say, we're going to come up with this great EBITDA alignment model. We're going to joint venture, but EBITDA may go down over the course of the investment, or it may stay flat for the first 2 years because of all those investments. And the docs are sitting there saying, hold on a second, my compensation hasn't recovered. I haven't seen any uptick. Private equity saying, don't worry, you'll get the benefit of this at the exit. I think it's hard for them to sometimes see that and have that same confidence as the investor has. And so I think that's a challenge where you've got to be really thoughtful around how you structure. In some ways, cash compensation to the doctors doesn't necessarily shouldn't tie exactly to EBITDA, because I think that might not put the right incentives in terms of how they think about the business. I'd
Yeah.
love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, we also spend a lot of time thinking about income repair, right? For the component of EBITDA that we buy down, it is very important to us to try to get the docs back to basically their pre-transaction cash comp salary as soon as possible. Because, even if they've received a fairly significant check up front, a year or two down the line, they're mainly looking at their lower annual cash comp than they are the liquidity event that they had at the time of the transaction. I think you're quite right on that. And so, from our perspective, it's really doing the work up front that we can become quite confident that the different value levers that we're going to work with the physician practice to pull over our ownership period can do that income repair as quickly as possible. If not, then you get a doctor, exactly as you're saying, a couple of years in, who's like, why did I do this transaction again? Because I used to make X and now I make 60% of X. That's or 70% of X. Like, this is a bad transaction.
Yeah, the benchmark is I probably sold somewhere near my high if I timed it just
Yeah,
right.
and I got a
My
multiple. on
practice
that.
was at its peak. It was presented beautifully. I believe the sim that my banker wrote for me. I'm an amazing asset, and that's the point in time that you're going to be compared to from that
Yeah.
point onwards. And so it's unrealistic. The truth is, it's completely unrealistic, and you will see volatility, and you will have, whether it's year 2, year 4, year 1, year 7, year 8, someone's going to be owning that asset as a majority owner with performance dipping drastically, and immediately the mind will take the physician back to that point in time where had he or she not sold, the business would have been so much better, income would have been higher. It's just not realistic. Disney also has bad years, right? They have bad movies that flop and they have to take a large write-off. So how do you bridge those two things? For me, and compensation, by the way, is only going to get more complicated as we push the practice world into RVUs, right? We've had a honeymoon period, I say it again, where it's all been cash income. It's all been very clear, very easy, but it's actually going to get more and more complicated as we compensate physicians for much more than just cash-based value creation. That's ahead of us. The hospitals have been wrestling with this for a long time. So what's the solution? In my opinion, you have to create a relationship with physicians that looks beyond just a very clinical and sterile, what did I make this month, this year? There has to be more of a bridge between the various parties than that. And if there is, they genuinely understand that you have a history of prioritizing their financial well-being. You have a history of prioritizing risk management. You have a mission as a business that you're actually executing on, then understanding the context of a bad quarter, of a bad year, for reasons that probably have nothing to do with the organization, becomes a little bit more palatable. Most physicians that I've experienced working with, and I've partnered with many, many hundreds at this point, will understand that, will come along for that ride. Some won't, and will be very non-responsive and even disruptive to a bad quarter or a bad year. Those are probably the physicians that you want to find out about ahead of time and probably not partner with because they're not good partners.
So a couple of quick things that I see as counsel in these deals, both sell and buy side, frankly. But I'll talk about the buy side quickly and in a little bit with a little bit of humor. If you come up to a practice location and the Bugatti Chiron or the Rolls Silver Ghost or even the Porsche is sitting in the parking lot, you want to know whose is that, right? And who's paying for it. Because it'll come down literally to a closing. And all of a sudden the physician will say, well, somebody's paying my car payments. And private equity investor will go, I'm not doing that. That's not my problem. I'm giving you 40, 50, $100 million for this practice. You want a Bugatti, not my problem. And it creates insane tension for no purpose, right? And I'm being ridiculous, obviously, in my examples, but I've been there. There are simpler examples, by the way. Family members with no-show jobs to be on benefits, right? You want to understand those personal things that a founder has done with their business as soon as you can, to get ahead of that stuff, to not have them be adversarial issues when you're trying to close, right? Because nobody's paying attention to what excluded assets are on the schedules, right? Everybody's waiting till the end to deal with that stuff, and then all of a sudden you come up with these just insane issues, right? Really expensive artwork on the walls that you have no interest in keeping, right? And you're not going to insure $100 million for the Picassos. It's not, you'll put prints up on the wall. Take it out of here, Doc. They're yours, right? And so you want to know that kind of stuff. The other issue that comes up a lot is, and this goes back to a bunch of things that everyone said, not always, but on average, smaller practices or mid-sized practices, their counsel may be the first conversation they're having with a buyer's private equity counsel and doing a deal. And they're not sophisticated enough to recognize that this is not a true, I'm selling my entire business to you. I've got no trailing liability on anything here. Have my business. I'm done. I'm walking away. These structures are such, right, that you often, unless you have another physician that's coming in to the professional practice, right, you may often want to retain that doctor or doctors as the equity holders in the professional practice. And that comes with responsibility. They can't just be no-show owners, right, of their own professional practice. And usually in those smaller deals, that counsel just simply doesn't get it and is unable to explain to them what the issues are. And I have very often become can you explain it to them? And I'm saying, and I have to start out the conversation by saying, look, I'm not your lawyer, but here's how this works, right? And it can, depending on the sophistication of the counsel on the other side, it can take months to get through those issues. And so you need to know up front, if you're thinking of retaining those physicians and the equity holders and the professional entities, okay, you need to talk with them about it, business to business person, immediately, so that you get ahead of it. Because again, it's not one of those things you want to be at the end where all of a sudden the lawyer on the other side won't agree to half the basic terms any management agreement would have in it, right? They're making issues of things that are just standard to management agreements, right? And you just can't get the deal done as a result. Okay, we have a few more minutes. Let's do one quick. Hopefully, let's answer this. Let's talk about this question quickly, and then I want to ask, see if we have questions, because I think it's important, because while I think it's settling out, there certainly have been changes to how PPMs are just working these days as a result of the pandemic. We had a conversation between us about the idea that, you call up your primary care practice these days, and if you're a new patient, you can't get an appointment for 6 months, right? Specialty practice, you can't get an appointment for 12 months. There's obviously pent-up demand, a lot of craziness going on. How has those ongoing operational effects, and there are multitudes of them, right, had an effect on who's buying what we're seeing, how the businesses are working? Roy, why don't we start with you?
Let me go last on this one.
Okay.
I'm happy to jump in. From my perspective, where the real opportunity is that that urgent care component of the ecosystem. I think the traditional urgent care, where you're going in person and they're billing at effectively emergency department rates, clearly is not taking costs out of the system. It's costing the patient more, it's costing the insurance company more. I think the real opportunity is, through COVID, we've all gotten more accustomed. Many of us had our first experience with telemedicine. I think people are more accustomed, they're more interested in it. I think it used to be pre-COVID, it was, the teledocs of the world, or the telemedicine, the Amwells, was kind of a separate service from your primary care group. We're now seeing telemedicine is really a component of primary care, and it should all be kind of merged together. The question becomes, can that now kind of replace a lot of these urgent care can you get the access? And I think what also is coming out of the COVID experience, I think people are valuing access and convenience probably higher than they are necessarily having to see their GP or their single physician. And so I think models are going to need to change, but also consumer behavior is going to need to change, because you can't have it both ways. You can't have a one-to-one physician relationship but expect that they're going to be on call every second of the day. But you should be able to have opportunity to text someone, get a response back, schedule same day appointments, get virtual care. And I think that is evolving, and hopefully will provide access more efficiently and bring the cost point down.
I think that just from an operational perspective, how are practices doing? They are stressed in that, yes, I completely agree with you. There are more patients who want to come through with more later stage diseases than there were a couple of years ago. And that's certainly putting a burden on the practices. But I think where many practices are kind of really feeling the pain, and actually where the consolidation and private equity can help a lot, is around just the labor and the complexity of sort of the practice operations. It is not uncommon that we're looking at a bolt-on transaction, and like their biggest problem is practice manager has turned over twice in the last 2 years, which means they're seeing every 3-month turnover of the scheduler, which means their sort of schedule efficiency at an individual practice level is way down, and like all of these problems just sort of cascade. By being part of a larger organization, having greater ability to recruit and optimize different components of the practice operations, you can alleviate some of these challenges. That is probably the biggest pain that I'm seeing in practices.
Yeah, I'd say the macro trends here that I keep an eye on, I find particularly interesting. Just like in many other industries, we have some ailments here in healthcare that are bad and getting worse. We just haven't solved them. So supply constraint in clinical care. The number of physician, nurse graduates on an annual basis versus demand, technicians versus demand. You see it in one specialty after another, and the problem seems to get worse from one year to the next, and will probably continue to get worse because we've built an industry, medical education, which is dysfunctional, to say the least. And I don't see any immediate, rapid technology-based solutions there. But just like in many other industries, COVID is an example. We were completely unprepared in so many ways, and yet developed a vaccine in record time, 10 times faster than we've ever developed before. So we're waiting for a miracle solution here in healthcare. And we have several candidates, right? We've discovered 2 new sites of service in the past 24 months, telemedicine and home care. Who knew? You can add them to the list of hospitals and practices. It's a whole new greenfield space for all of us to explore and have fun with. So while we run out of physical supply in one end, we might substitute for virtual supply in the other. But these are maybes. They're not guarantees. And so, the experiments are all ahead of us. They're interesting. They'll probably work out, but they come with a lot of risk and uncertainty. And we certainly can't sit here comfortably. And we can probably expect there's at least a 50% chance that we'll look at healthcare 5 years from now the way that we look at transportation today, which is pining for the 50s. When highways were free of traffic, when airlines gave you great service, where you arrived on time, where trains ran on time. 50 years ago, life was much better. And there's a good chance that 5, 10, 15 years from now, we'll look at healthcare and have the same feelings. There was a time when I wanted to see a doctor, I did. I didn't have to wait 12 months and get sent to someone who has no idea what they're doing. So we have to be wary of that. There's also a 50% chance that we don't reach that conclusion. But I think Elon Musk wrote about this with space travel. it's not set in stone that every industry just improves from one decade to the next. Some fall back on themselves. So we just have to keep a very close eye on that.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen. Questions? Any questions? Always it crickets when you first ask that. And then somebody decides to raise their hand. There you go.
I like more of a question. But have there been challenges?
So I'm going to repeat it just so that we hear it on our Zoom and everything. And so, have there been any sort of challenges to the PCMSO model more recently that have given investors pause? I think the answer is yes. There have been more attempts to hold investors liable for pulling strings they shouldn't be pulling, so to speak, for lack of a better way of thinking about it, in PCMSO models where a state regulator may believe that a investor is just sort of sticking their hands in the professional practice more than they should be. Now, as you can imagine, in certain states that's becoming more of an issue, in states that care a lot about it, and in other states where they're moving away from the corporate practice prohibition completely, they just don't even care, right? And they're also, though, a bunch of those challenges are interesting in the sense that they're led by not necessarily somebody coming up and saying, "Wow, these investors, they're impinging upon the professional services being provided by the professionals," as much as the Aspen Dental settlement in New York started out by basically consumers complaining about quality, right? And then it became a settlement over corporate practice issues, right? And it was sort of the AG pulling back the onion and saying, well, we have a problem with these complaints we keep getting about quality issues. And well, who's really pulling the strings about whether or not this person gets a filling in those kinds of things, and felt that there was a little too much control being, I'm losing my words, but that essentially the investor was putting a little bit too much control on the practices. And so you are seeing that. You're also seeing, unfortunately, this goes back to something Bede said. I wanted to mention it earlier. The understanding of physicians about investment by PE. You've had front page articles on the New England Journal of Medicine about PE investment in physician practices, and both good and bad. In fact, that last article was pretty balanced. But you essentially are seeing, if you see Congress talking about physician practice investment, you see them talking about SNF investment, which I don't even understand. And so there's more scrutiny. There's definitely more scrutiny. Whether or not it's something to really be worried about, I don't think it is, because frankly, it's a question of like in many situations, it's a question of sort of bad apples or people not being smart about how they do this. Who are the folks that are really getting tripped up? So,
of all the list of all the things that are horribly wrong in the world, does private equity support for physician practice management rank highly? And I think if you look at it objectively, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that we won't have interesting cases. It doesn't mean that we won't have interesting journalists, interesting politicians, but you do need that last step where it is fundamentally broken and wrong for you to start to attach a really high risk of fundamental change, like binary change in the near term. And you look at other industries that really check that last box, something horribly wrong about the way that you're treating plastics and pollution in our oceans. And they're still struggling to make binary change. So it's very hard to take large industry and all the movement that went into those industries, cumulative over hundreds of years, tens of years, and sort of undo it all. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it's sort of the likelihood of it happening when there's nothing fundamentally that wrong about it to begin with, I wouldn't say is that high. But don't hold me to that. In December, post-November.
Well, the other thing that's important about that is that, frankly, on average, the likelihood that an investor, even being with his physician degree, is going to be telling a professional involved in an investment whether or not they should be doing surgery or not, right, is pretty darn low, right? You might be telling them that you've got great IT and different ways to schedule patients and those kinds of things. But the likelihood that any investor is truly sticking their nose in the professional practice of the professional, just very, very unlikely. And that's really where you're getting into trouble.
I would be very cautious of an investor who knows medicine particularly well.
Yeah. We make it very clear from the onset with any relationship that clinical autonomy is 100%, right? And despite the fact that I may be a physician by training, I would never have that conversation. The line is really clear, and like this is just kind of not an issue for us. And to the point that was made at the onset, there are some states that just don't care, and there are some states where we are very aware that they care a lot, and we pay a lot of attention to make sure we cross every T and dot every I in those states.
Look, the perfect example, Ohio, several years ago now, maybe even 10 years ago, the Attorney General in Ohio just wrote an Attorney General opinion basically saying, we no longer have any sort of corporate practice prohibition. We're done. Every health lawyer in Ohio went, what? Okay. That was just totally bizarre. New York State, it's not even about controlling the professional services. New York State looks at a management arrangement with a professional organization, and if they don't like the financial structure, they still believe there's too many strings being pulled, right? New York and California, a bunch of Illinois, a bunch of other states are like that, where they will look at the totality of the control being exercised, not just whether or not you're telling somebody to perform surgery, right? Or not perform surgery, whatever. And they will see that as a potential corporate practice violation.
Advice for anyone in healthcare in America is do business in New York, do business in California, but don't do business solely in New York or California.
Yeah.
Looked at previous a lot of there's a lot of competition. Question: how do you see that market? This model. What is that?
Could you repeat the question for me?
Yeah, the question was, what do we anticipate the nature of the relationship between health systems, small, medium, large, and the MSO PPM space, the other side? Fragile to start because everyone's gaze is elsewhere. Opportunities in the PPM space don't necessarily circle around my health system relationships. It's not top of the list in most cases. And so a natural enemy threat that appears out of nowhere, has greater firepower, purchasing power than I do, is a direct competitor for my providers, my patients. And so not a surprise that relationships are frail in many cases. And you see that, you see open conflict in health systems that are holding on to their providers and objecting to approval processes. But I do actually think that 5 and definitely 10 years from now, you'll see a complete inversion of that, because actually it is on the list of things that are important that actually offer value creation. And whether it's a health system, more likely the PPM entity that gets there first with an olive branch and a really good business plan, interoperative monitoring, or network development that results in performance-based reimbursement agreements, cross referrals that are compliant, co-investments in large capex projects, something. And there's a long list. There's a really long list. In fact, my pet peeves of the top 5 things that MSOs grossly underinvested in. We just did a webinar on this. In the top 5 easily is strategic partnerships. And in the top 5 of all strategic partnerships for every MSO is talk to me about your hospital strategic partnership. So again, we've only just begun there. And hospitals might be difficult. They might be culturally difficult, and they might hold it against us the way that Coke and Pepsi go at it. But I suspect most won't. And ultimately, if we can really be partners, we'll be partners.
I think, just like politics, all healthcare is local. And there is, if you're talking about a very rural area where there's one provider and one health system, it's a very different dynamic than across the street. And so, that needs to be taken into consideration. Generally, I agree with what Roy said. War between physician practices and health systems at the end of the day tends to cause casualties on all sides and is probably not the best option. I think that health systems, this is where the local content comes in. Some health systems are still very much engaged in a older model of they should be the focus and more, physician employment, especially in certain specialties. And other health systems have literally hundreds of JV relationships, and they are excellent capital partners to physicians who are looking to build ASCs or other outpatient facilities. So, it's, I think we settle into kind of a stable equilibrium with tension on either side. But what I would hope is that, and this is back to a comment I made much earlier, the physicians, they need some scale and they need some support in those areas where they aren't the only player in town to reach that equilibrium with a, potentially multi-billion-dollar health system partner.
As Ascension partnered with the private equity group, separate vehicle to fund rapid ASC development. First purchase was an ASC management company. I think it was Regent. I think every hospital system has an opportunity to create a separate entity that is eligible for private equity investment. And I think at some point, the whole industry will look at $1 trillion of healthcare available capital that exists in private equity and say, why not us? And I think that's going to be a very interesting time.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I think a lot of this is predicated on the old school reimbursement model, which is a fee-for-service driven approach to hospitals make the most money because they bill the most, right? And you produce more volume, you get paid more. Hospitals historically have been used to really being the center of the healthcare ecosystem. As you move to a capitated value-based model, you make more money by not doing those services, by not bringing people to the hospital. And so, I think the forward-thinking systems are realizing that, and they're saying it's the primary care, it's the physicians that drive the referrals that actually are going to be controlling utilization, controlling spend. We got to get ahead of that. And that's where the puck is heading. That's where the power is going to be. And so I look at it as it's a paradigm shift. This is one of the most exciting times to be in healthcare because really, when you think about it, all the power used to be in the hospitals and the specialists that, build for the most expensive procedures, where it's now all shifting to the primary care physicians and the gatekeepers. And so I think health systems need to completely realign themselves to the future, which is the patient and the primary care really at the center of the ecosystem, and the hospital really along one of the spokes, not at the center. But many health systems can't get out of their own way, and they're just making too much money right now in fee-for-service medicine. And so, I think it's going to be interesting to see when that shift occurs.
There still is some interesting innovation. Going back even 10 plus years, but with health systems where they're there are some good examples. Roy gave one of them of health systems JVing with private equity to do something in the physician space. We've got a urgent care JV here in New York between a very large health system and a PE fund. You've also got, I've done this in the last couple of years, you've got health systems moving their employee docs into a PPM structure with the idea that either they'll bring in a JV partner in their management to the PPM side and or sell it off to monetize it, which is very interesting. These are systems that have for 100 years employed their doctors, right? And finally looking at it as a potential way that if they can align with an investor, it'll bring a big check to them. And so there's a lot of folks doing a lot of different things. I mean, I can't say that the examples I just gave are happening everywhere, but they're starting to happen. And depending on the health system, depending on the locality, you're seeing some interesting things happen. Are there any other quick questions? If not, I think we're going to say thank you. We really appreciate you coming. Thank you to Dee. Thank you to Andrew. Thank you to Roy. Really appreciate you folks coming this morning and enjoying the conversation and participating in it. Thanks again.
Thank you.